Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final meeting of the Ending 911 Fee Diversion Now Strike Force, or the 911 Strike Force, which we now call to order. Thank you for being here today. My name is John Ivanoff, Designated Federal Officer of this advisory committee. My colleague, Jill Coogan, is the Deputy Designated Federal Officer. Also with us here today is Rachel Weir, an FCC Working Group Liaison. I am also the Division Chief in the Policy and Licensing Division of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. Now, I will briefly outline today's agenda. We'll begin with a welcome and some opening remarks from Lisa M. Folks, Chief of the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. Following the welcome by Chief Folks, Kelly Merriweather, Chair of the 911 Strike Force, will deliver brief remarks and perform a roll call. Kelly is the Executive Director of the Texas Commission on State Emergency Communications, representing the National Association of State 911 Administrators, as NASNA's president. Following roll call, Stephen Sharp, Vice Chair of the 911 Strike Force, will deliver an executive summary of the 911 Strike Force recommendations. Steve is the Director of Genesee County, New York Emergency Communications, representing the New York State 911 Coordinators Association. Kelly and Steve will introduce the working group chairs and vice chairs to read out their final recommendations contained in the 911 Strike Force report. The three working groups are Working Group 1, Effectiveness of Federal Laws in Ending 911 Fee Diversion. Working Group 2, Whether Criminal Penalties Would Further Prevent 911 Fee Diversion. And Working Group 3, The Impacts of 911 Fee Diversion. 911 Strike Force Chair, Kelly Merriweather, will then offer concluding remarks. Following the working group readouts, the members of the public may ask questions. Members of the 911 Strike Force will then have an opportunity to engage in discussion of the 911 Strike Force's final recommendations. Following the member discussion, Chair Kelly Merriweather will call a vote on the recommendations. Following the vote, we will adjourn the meeting. Now, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for today's meeting. First, to the members, please remain on mute unless speaking. Second, raise your virtual hand to be recognized, and raise your virtual hand during the discussion session at the end of all three presentations, should you have questions or comments. Third, refrain from using the chat function during the session, as the chat function does not conform to record-keeping requirements. Fourth, all Strike Force-related email communications should CC the 911 Strike Force at fcc.gov email account and me at john.ivanoff@fcc.gov. Fifth, during this meeting, the public may submit questions at livequestions@fcc.gov, and we will respond to those questions during the public questions segment. Lastly, if you are presenting today, please ask Rachel Weir, Working Group Liaison, to advance the slides as necessary during your presentations. With that said, I would now like to begin today's meeting. I would like to introduce the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau Chief, Lisa M. Folks, who will deliver opening remarks. Chief Folks.
Thank you, John. And good morning to the chair, vice chair, and members of the 911 Strike Force and working groups. As you know, last December, Congress enacted legislation directing the Commission to take specific actions within tight timeframes to address 911 fee diversion. These tight timeframes reflected the urgency of this issue. First, Congress directed the Commission to adopt rules within 180 days that designate which 911 fee uses are acceptable and which constitute fee diversion. The Commission acted swiftly and adopted those rules by its June deadline. Second, Congress directed the Commission to establish this committee, the 911 Strike Force, to study and make recommendations on how the federal government can most expeditiously end fee diversion, with a report due by September 23rd. Today, after a summer of hard work, you will vote on your report to Congress on how federal laws and regulations can be used to end 911 fee diversion, whether criminal penalties could further prevent fee diversion, and what impacts result from fee diversion, including underfunding America's 911 system. I give my sincere thanks to all the members of the Strike Force and its working groups for your hard work and dedication. As representatives of states, federal programs, tribal organizations, local jurisdictions, public safety organizations, consumers, and 911 professionals, you have important day jobs. You have made personal sacrifices to devote time every week to deliberate on the recommendations of this report. We also recognize that this was an especially challenging summer for you and your fellow public safety professionals as you face challenges ranging from wildfires in the west to Hurricanes Ida and Nicholas in the south and east, all against the backdrop of an ongoing pandemic. We greatly appreciate the extraordinary knowledge and energy you brought to this mission. I especially want to thank Kelly Merriweather for serving as chair and Stephen Sharp for serving as vice chair of the strike force. It is a testament to both their leadership and the members' hard work that the strike force has completed its report in such a short time. I am confident that your report will aid Congress's and the Commission's deliberations on this important public safety issue. I also want to thank FCC staff John Evanoff, the designated federal officer for this federal advisory committee, Jill Coogan, the deputy designated federal officer, and Rachel Ware, working group liaison, for their fantastic work in assisting the strike force in accomplishing its goals. We look forward to closely reviewing the recommendations in your report. Your work over the past 4 months has truly been an act of service to our nation's 911 systems and the safety of the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Folks. We will now turn to 911 Strike Force Chair Kelly Merriweather to deliver remarks and perform a roll call. Kelly.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Chief, for those kind and rewarding remarks. We really appreciate those. Today, the 911 Strike Force is pleased to present our final report and recommendations for ending 911 fee diversion. I'd like to thank you all on the Strike Force and the FCC team for your time and knowledge and your service to this important cause. This cohort of talented 911 experts from across the entire country convened, deliberated, and developed an excellent report of recommendations to Congress and the FCC. We all have confidence that our work will have meaning and lasting impact and will result in improving and enhancing 911 communications now and in the future. So we're all really excited to begin this meeting and present you with our recommendations. So we will begin with a roll call. I'll start with the 911 Strike Force members first. So let's start with Cindy Barbera-Brell. Cindy?
Present.
Richard Bradford?
Present.
Daryl Branston?
Present.
Terry Clark? Terry Clark? Hearing none. Budge Courier?
Present.
Lori Flaherty? Hearing none. Sean Golden?
Present.
April Heinze?
Present.
Karima Holmes?
Present.
Thaddeus Johnson?
Present.
Mel Meyer?
Present.
Nicole Pickrell?
Present.
Allison Venable, alternate for Mark Reddish? Allison? I see Allison's name, but I don't hear her. Allison? You might be on mute. We'll come back to you. Okay. Stephen Sharp?
Present.
Lance Terry?
Present.
And Dana Wahlberg?
Present.
Of this, and I'm present as well, Kelly Merriweather. And so as the 17 members, we have all but 2 present, and we have a quorum, John. So next we're going to move on. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. I just want to give Allison one opportunity to hear to
Okay.
record that she's in attendance. Allison?
I see that Allison unmuted herself, but Allison, we cannot hear you.
Present.
Thank you.
Allison. We can hear you. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
All right. Well, the count did include Allison, so all but 2 of us are here, so we do have a quorum present. And so now we'll move on to our roll call of the working group only members. Let's start with Peter. Peter Beckwith,
Present.
Patricia Coates,
Present.
Mark Fletcher,
Present.
James Goldstein,
Present.
Jeffrey Jelinski,
Present.
Kathy Jones Gooding,
Present.
Leah Misseldine,
Present.
Barbara Neal,
Present.
Matt Tooley. Matt Tooley. Not hearing Matt. All right, all but 1 of the working group members has signified their presence. So we have a quorum and a good group of our working group only members. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to our Vice Chair of the Committee and Strike Force, Dr. Stephen Sharp, Vice Chair. He is the Director of Genesee County and representing New York State 911 coordinators. And Steve is going to present the executive summary of our 911 Strike Force recommendations. Steve?
Thank you, Kellyanna. I just want to thank you and the FCC staff for all the work that they've done along with those strike force members. Your leadership has been invaluable during this process, so thank you. One of the things that we did as chair and vice chair is we were responsible for the executive summary and the conclusions. So what we ended up doing is we took what the 3 working groups provided and we tried to consolidate and summarize the overall consensus of the strike force, and we reached 7 findings. Next slide, please. One of the first things that we determined as a strike force was that 911 fee diversion negatively impacts public safety, 911 operations, first responders, and most importantly, the physical sustainability of 911 service in the United States of America. I don't think this was very hard for anybody to come to. In fact, that's the reason why this group was formed. What's important to realize is when we compel people to give us their revenue for a specific purpose, the idea is that we use that revenue for the purpose that we told them that we were taking their revenue, which leads to the second point. 911 fee receipts and expenditures should be distinguishable and, more importantly, auditable to ensure that the money that we have received from the public is used for the purpose that we say it's going to be used for. Now, what is one of the major questions is what are eligible activities and what are not eligible activities, which leads us to our next point. 911 systems require significant capital and recurring operational expenditures. It takes people, it takes equipment, and then most importantly, it takes capital expenditures to make sure that these systems stay operational, as well as we start doing long-term planning for what's next coming down the line. If we can end fee diversion, then hopefully we can work towards accomplishing that end to ensure that 911 service in the United States of America is sustainable. One of the things that we need to do is ensure that we have access to greater funding, whether that's federal grants, state grants, appropriations at the local, state, and federal level. And more importantly, that those appropriations and grants come with prohibitions against 911 fee diversion. The purpose is to ensure that we financially disincentivize 911 fee diversion. If the penalty for 911 fee diversion is less than the gain from diverting 911 funds, then fee diversion is likely not to end. Next slide, please. The strike force members agree that 911 fee diversion requires direct enforcement action by the FCC. Majority of the FCC members, the strike force members, agree that enforcement action should follow an escalating path towards achieving a resolution. Now, where members of the strike force have concerns is that we have different recommendations as to how we employ those enforcement actions. We have recommendations including escalating fines. We have recommendations including FCC licensing enforcement actions, as well as criminal referrals. One of the things that the strike force would like to caution the FCC and Congress about is we need further study to understand what the potential impact of any of those actions would have on public safety. We do need to have enforcement action to end fee diversion. What that enforcement action looks like is something that we need to evaluate very closely. We've had a number of concerns raised, and we're going to be talking about it more in the working group reports. But it is important to note that if you don't have enforcement action, fee diversion will continue to go on unchecked. Also important to that is that state and local 911 authorities should be accountable for their own behavior. Currently, the report and order has states responsible for the actions of the local agencies. And currently, under grant guidance, the local agencies are held accountable for state legislatures diverting 911 funds, so they do not have access to programs such as federal 911 grants. We believe that states should not be punished for locals, and we also believe that locals should not be punished for states. Working Group 1 will discuss this a little bit further. Next slide, please. The FCC requires additional authority to ensure that local agencies are providing information to the states for the compilation of the annual report to Congress. Working Group 2 went into very specific details about how the collection methodology may require some adjustment to assist in this effort. The idea is we don't know how deep or how little the problem is until we have better data from local and state agencies regarding fee diversion. More importantly, we need to understand how we define fee diversion. We believe that the definition of eligible 911 expenditures should be those activities that directly support the entire 911 communications ecosystem between the 911 entry point and first responders. We need to ensure that we have the ability to not only receive the 911 call or the 911 request for service, but that we can communicate that alarm to our first responders and effectively communicate with them. Working Group 1 will be discussing this further. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Working Group 1. Next slide, please. And specifically, Budge Courier. Thank you, Budge.
Thank you, Steve. If you could just advance to the next slide, please. I wanted to start with a list of the Working Group 1 members. These folks met numerous times throughout the development of this report and provided invaluable insight, comments, feedback, deliberation, and at times some rather heated debates for us to arrive at a consensus report. And each of the folks that you see here represented the agencies that they serve and ensured that the document that was produced was unanimous and reflected the needs of the PSAPs, 911 centers, ECCs, first responders, and the associations that we all belong to. So I really want to thank each of them for the hard work that they put into this report and into these findings. And without them, the next few slides would not even be possible. So I just want to express my thanks and gratitude to the members of the team for everything you participated in. And thank you for allowing me to share the results of our hard work. So if you move to the next slide, I'm going to work through the tasks that we were assigned to complete. We were asked to determine the effectiveness of laws, regulations, policies, practices, and other constraints on how to most expeditiously end fee diversion. And that's a really important part of the process because we didn't just stop at what laws exist, but what can actually be put in place to end fee diversion. And that's what we focused on. And then we took a close look at the acceptable use of 911 fees. We came up with a good definition. It's one of our first recommendations that I'll be covering. And then we took a look at wireless providers and whether fee diversion should be or fees should be allowed to subsidize commercial wireless towers. And we'll talk about that in our recommendations as well. So if you move to the next slide, as a result of the work that we completed, we took a look at existing statute, both at the federal, local, and state level, best practices. We looked at states that are doing extremely well in accounting for and distributing 911 fees, and also those states that have been identified as fee diverters, to look at some recommendations on how we could come up with a path forward that would end fee diversion. And we want to make it very clear that these next set of slides are a holistic approach, and picking and choosing one and ignoring another would violate the consensus that was used to develop these recommendations. So this shouldn't be viewed as a list where you can pick and choose, but rather a holistic approach where if all of these are implemented, then the working group 1 feels very strongly that fee diversion would be ended. The second recommendation includes a definition that we did brief out at the last meeting, and want to be clear that the use of 911 fees should include the ability for local agencies and states to fund any communication system, technology, or support activity, and this is critical, that directly provides the ability to deliver 911 voice and data and information between the entry point into the 911 system and the first responder. And this includes, but may not be limited to, those items that are in the report. And it also want to make it clear that this definition recognizes that 911 telecommunicators are first responders. So that first responder in that definition recognizes that. The entry point into the 911 system is something that's important to understand. It's identified in Part 47, and it's the point where the carrier is delivering the call to the 911 system. So from that point forward, all the way to when that information is delivered to a first responder, including a dispatch center or an ECC or a PSAP, that entire process and everything that's used to do that could be supported by 911 fees. The report and order defined the eligible use of 911 fees, but it's also important to note that state and local agencies can adopt guidelines that are more restrictive than that federal definition. So if a state determines or a local agency determines that something is not an eligible use, they could be more restrictive, but you cannot open it up and make it more inclusive. In other words, the federal guidelines provide the minimum eligible use of 911 fees. Next slide. The fourth recommendation is that federal grant programs should include that include public safety communications as an eligible expense, should also include 911, and 911 agencies should be able to apply for those grants, because the definition that we're recommending would extend the eligible use of 911 fees into things like land mobile radio systems. Then it would be important to allow 911 agencies to apply for those grants and use those grants for things like radio consoles that are inside dispatch centers, for example. We also think that the fifth recommendation, that the federal grant funding for 911 should be increased. And I know that there's efforts underway at the federal level right now to make that possible. And we think that's an important part of the ending fee diversion. And this is something that Steve talked about. State agencies that divert 911 fees should not be eligible for federal grant funding. That includes 911 as an eligible expense. So if you're a fee diverter, then you would not be eligible for that federal grant funding. If that federal grant funding is substantial, then this becomes a very good mechanism to end fee diversion. Also, states that divert 911 fees would still have an obligation to service the state administrative authority, but they would have to pass through 100% of the remaining grant funding to the local agencies. We understand there are some administrative costs to just pass that funding through. And we also make the recommendation to Congress that this should be looked at in further detail to ensure that there's all the federal guidelines concerning grant funding are followed with this recommendation. But in this way, if this is put into practice, then a state that's diverting 911 fees would not be eligible for the funding at the state level, but the local agencies within that state would still be eligible. And that's the next bullet there, is that, you know, these fee diverting states that service the state administrative authority, we need to determine if that's allowable or not. If you go to the next slide, the 9th recommendation is that local agencies that divert 911 fees would not be eligible for federal grant funding. That included 911 as an eligible expense, either as a direct grantee or as a sub-grantee from the state. And if there's a state administrative authority that has local agencies that divert fees, they should ensure that no local 911 fee diverting agency receives any of that grant funding. So these last few recommendations all go to the point that the state should not be penalized for the actions of a local agency, and similarly, a local agency should not be penalized for the actions of the state. The next recommendation really has to do with accounting and being able to track whether a local agency is diverting fees, or a state agency for that matter. We're recommending that the FCC modify the license application process for all public safety spectrum licenses through the universal licensing system to just include the simple question, is the applicant diverting 911 fees as it's currently defined in the FCC rules? And it's a yes or no question. Answering yes or no to this question would allow the states to quickly identify local agencies that may be diverting fees, and similarly that would allow the FCC to know which state agencies or state and local license holders were diverting 911 fees. So this is merely just an accountability piece that we think would be rather easy to implement. The next step in the process requires a little bit more explanation. So the recommendation is that if there is an FCC license applicant that's diverting fees, they should not be eligible for license renewals, modifications, or new licenses until they've provided an approved remediation plan to the FCC. Now, the remediation process should be very progressive, should follow specific requirements and go through a specific process that allows time to remediate whatever they're doing at the local level in terms of fee diversion before FCC licenses are impacted. So the idea is that if you checked yes in the form in recommendation 11, you wouldn't immediately lose 911 fees or grant funding or anything else that you're receiving. But there's a process in place where you put in the corrective action to end fee diversion. And if you're not successful in that process, then additional steps could be taken in a progressive manner. So it's not an immediate impact, but we do think this is an important part of the enforcement process and aligns directly with the eligible use of 911 fees. On the next slide, recommendation 13, we think that the FCC should clarify the language in the fee diversion report and order to ensure that a state is not denied applications based on the behavior of local agencies or vice versa. And it probably is also a good idea to determine a start date for this requirement. And there should be a definitive timeline that allows state and local agencies to put processes in place. There may be local statutes or policies or procedures or state statutes or policies, procedures that need to be updated. And so the timeline should take all of that into account. We also think that the FCC should direct carriers to include a separate line item in the bill to the consumer that is specifically identifies either 911 fee or 911 surcharge, so that it's easy to identify the funds that are collected for 911. This is important from an accounting perspective so that you can do a reconciliation of what was collected for 911 fees versus what was distributed to the state or the local agency for 911 fees, so that you can map that process out. We also think that state and local fee structures should clearly identify the allowable use of 911 fees. Now, these would have to align with the FCC report and order, but if there's a multi-purpose fee where numerous things are being collected, then you should very clearly articulate this is 911 fees, and there may be other special use fees and other multi-purpose fees that are collected, but you want to clearly give a breakdown of the fee structure so that eligible 911 fees can be identified. 16, any state or local funds that are deposited into designated accounts, there should be an auditing process in place to ensure that they were used exclusively for eligible 911 expenditures. On the next slide, recommendation number 17, state and local authorities should ensure that statutes, policies, procedures, and rules are updated to reflect the final FCC report and order. There is a report and order that was recently released, and then as a result of the recommendations of this process, there may be further refinement to that report and order, and state and local authorities would just have to ensure that existing statutes align with those changes that happen at the federal level. We also think that the grant process should be reviewed at the state and local level to ensure that there's equitable access to all potential 911 funding sources. And our final recommendation is that an appropriation and authorization should be adopted to revise the 2018 study that was conducted that provided an estimate of what was needed to support 911 fees, because due to the expanded definition that we've recommended, there are additional expenditures that were not identified in that 2018 study that would need to be adjusted. And so we think that that should be looked at again. Now, there's a lot of recommendations here that we've gone through. It's obviously a very conclusive and detailed look at this that we took, but we wanted to give some examples of, based on this definition that we provided in recommendation number 2, what are eligible uses of 911 fees? Some of the items in this list are probably very apparent to some folks, and historically have always been funded through 911 fees. Things like Legacy 911, Next Gen 911. We also wanted to specifically spell out 911 GIS system, which are critical for next generation 911. Cybersecurity, as it specifically relates to 911 and PSAP operations. Any equipment and services that are used in the PSAP or the ECC for emergency notification systems should be allowable. And then communication systems, which would include land mobile radio and any other communication system, and this is important to the definition, that directly supports the exchange of information between the PSAP and ECC and the first responder. So if the communication system is being used to transmit data and information from someone calling into 911 or exchanging data with 911 to the first responder, then it would be eligible. Call processing equipment or customer premise equipment or call handling equipment, as it's referred to, those would all be eligible. Computer-aided dispatch is eligible. Protocol-based caller interrogation systems, legacy and next gen 911 system analytics, and then training as allowed in the fee diversion report and order. And then any other expenses that are specifically called out in the existing report and order would all be examples of an eligible use. So on the next slide, what is some examples of what would not be eligible? So commercial communication systems would not be eligible. And this is funding for telecommunication providers to supply commercial telecommunication systems or to subsidize commercial wireless towers. These are not eligible because they occur before the entry point into the 911 system. LMR assets that are not directly supporting the transmission of information between the 911 caller and the first responder. So this would be something like jail or prison operations, because they're not in that path. Subscriber units that are on land mobile radio systems that are shared, but subscriber units for agencies like the Department of Transportation or emergency managers or other entities that are not directly supporting the delivery of data and information between the 911 request for assistance and the first responder. Those would not be eligible. And then LTE subscription plans that are not directly supporting this, delivery of data and information between the 911 request for assistance and the first responder. This is just a short sample of some of the ineligible uses, but we wanted to include this in the report so that you can see kind of the theme here. The test as to whether it's eligible is based in that definition. Is it used to directly support delivery of data and information between the 911 request for assistance and the first responder? On the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the implications of this. So these recommendations are, in some cases, very different with what might currently be in place in local and state statutes. And it may actually make some states fee diverters that are not considered fee diverters today. And similarly, some that are considered to be diverting 911 fees, they may no longer be considered fee diverters without doing anything different at the state and local level. So it'll be very important to communicate with those agencies to help them understand the changes that are happening at the FCC and at the federal level, and the order that those changes are happening, and when state and local agencies would be subject to these rules. Because this recommendation could be viewed as an expansion for some state and local authorities, maybe there's some out there that are not funding, say, land mobile radio systems today with 911 fees. They would need to ensure that their state statutes and policies and procedures and rules are updated to reflect the funding needs of the specific state and local authority. And this goes to that point where a state and local authority can be more restrictive, but not less restrictive. And so there is the need for the state and local authorities to take a close look at their statutes, policies, procedures, and rules to make sure that they reflect the specific funding needs of that agency. And again, we've said this numerous times, state and local agencies could be more restrictive, but not less restrictive than the recommendations at the federal level and the requirements at the federal level. And for those state and local agencies that have a stricter definition today, the addition of these eligible costs without increasing the overall 911 funding available, it will have a negative impact because it'll reduce the funding available for costs that are specific to the operation of the PSAP or the ECC for many jurisdictions. So we realize this is a significant implication, and it's something that state and local agencies will have to take a close look at. On the next slide, we have a couple of more implications. We realize that the successful adoption of the definition is dependent on everybody having equal access to the funding sources for emergency communications. And this includes both 911 agencies and first responder agencies. And right now, many of the funding sources, such as those in the SAFECOM guidance on emergency communications grants, exclude 911 as an eligible use of those funds. If these funding programs are not expanded and additional funding is not secured, these 911 agencies that manage the 911 fees, they might be challenged financially and administratively to support the expanded definition without additional funds to cover those costs. So the idea here is that if nothing is done to provide additional grant funding and you open up the eligible use of 911 fees, you're going to create a greater mismatch in the funding available to support the programs that are in existence today, and that expanded definition. And that's something that we looked very closely at as an implication. We also want to make it clear that FirstNet is legally and contractually precluded from using any funds for 911 related costs. And so they've got an exclusive funding resource, and they would not be eligible for 911 fees. Next slide. Based on the proposed definition, LTE connections that are used to connect CAD or deliver 911 data between NG 911 core services and the PSAP would be an eligible expense. So the idea is if your agency is using an LTE connection to deliver data to CAD out in the field, that's exchanging data between the 911 caller and the first responder, that's an eligible expense. And then many state and local authorities may need to seek increased 911 fees at the local level to cover the additional costs that are associated with any broadened definition. We talked about this before, but the cost study to Congress did not include items in that broader definition. So we think that it's important that there's an update of that study to include the additional costs associated with this. And then this broader definition may invite interpretation to expand this beyond communications used to deliver information to the emergency responders in the field and those radio networks and equipment. So it'll be very important to understand the definition and to apply that definition for the use of any 911 fees. Next slide. I'm going to now turn it over to Working Group 2 to go through the findings in their report. So thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning. My name is Richard Bradford. I'm happy to be here and present Working Group 2 to you this morning. We have a short presentation, and I'd like to move to the next slide. So these are the members of Working Group 2. I'd like to thank each member for their expertise, their knowledge, their experience representing their constituencies during our weekly meetings. I'd also like to thank our chair and vice chair for their leadership, and especially the commission staff for their guidance and assistance during our meetings over the past several weeks. It has been, extremely helpful to have everyone participate in presenting their perspectives. It's been quite an education, and I think very useful in generating a good report that has consensus built around our recommendations and conclusions. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the materials that we reviewed and researched. We relied on publicly available information. Working Group 2 members delved into this, conducted research, and made presentations back to our group. I would also say that the FCC Enforcement Bureau overview was very helpful to our understanding of substantive and procedural principles of the Bureau, how they proceed in enforcement actions. And I think this is relevant, of course, to some of what Budge mentioned, but also to Working Group 2's conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. So our general findings, there are a couple of slides here. Our general findings are first that state legislators are the primary actors diverting fees. States have reported their reliance upon state laws in the annual questionnaire responses filed with the Commission. We know that, of course, most PSAPs are operated by local governments, and the states have enacted laws, and as Budge indicated, there's a wide variety of how those have been implemented across the country. Our question, of course, focused just on, the element of whether criminal penalties would further prevent fee diversion. So our experience collectively is that states regard their 911 fees as state funds, and those are subject to control by the states. Next slide, please. We concluded that Congress's changes, coupled with the FCC's new rules, should end fee diversion. Our question, may be viewed as a yes or no recommendation, but further prevent, of course, implies that some action will decline or cease, or some form of abatement in fee diversion, and then whether criminal penalties would further assist in that effort. We considered the legislation enacted last December that removed the state's deference, and we anticipate that state legislation will follow within states' legislative calendars. That may take some time. As you heard, Working Group 1 recommendations also acknowledged the potential for time. We concluded that some form of criminal penalty may assist to further prevent diversion of 911 fees. We also concluded that any penalty should be limited to an imposition of monetary fines or forfeitures. Next slide, please. So we recognized that fee diversion, identification as a criminal act, has some, very negative connotations. There was a lot of discussion within our group. Identifying public officials as having criminal intent within what many people regard as criminal intent may create additional challenges to end fee diversion. I want to emphasize here that the group has no expectation. There is no recommendation that any natural person, any legislator, any public official, should be prosecuted or incarcerated or fined. Our recommendations are directed towards jurisdictions and jurisdictions alone. Next slide, please. So we also recognize that some penalties, such as the suspension or denial of licenses, may have negative impacts on entities or citizens who have no hand, that is, no part in diverting 911 fees. Now, I would point out here that each working group worked independently, as previously noted. Working Group 2's conclusions and the potential impact on licensing was developed independently from Working Group 1's recommendations. I found it interesting that the two groups working independently reached similar conclusions. But as shown in the executive summary, further study on this issue is recommended. Now, we debated penalties impacting licenses throughout our work over the past few weeks. Consensus was achieved by recognizing and recommending lesser penalties in a series of escalating enforcement actions. Next slide, please. This is our final slide, and this is a summary of our recommendations. I hope that everyone will read the report and look at the final fuller recommendations. But here, we recommend an escalation path. Discussions captured in our report recommend actions to ensure notice and opportunities are given to jurisdictions so they may avoid any penalties associated with fee diversion. So our initial recommendation is a fine of some kind. Subsequent penalties may include additional fines, which might comprise a percentage of fees diverted. If these fines fail, it is recommended that any new license applications should be delayed for a period of time, as an example, 60 to 180 days, or granted only as temporary licenses with approval based on satisfying conditions to end fee diversion. Now here, those conditions might include some demonstration that the jurisdiction is taking steps to end fee diversion. Recognizing legislative calendars and the variation across the country, that may take some time. Work Group 2 intends that any enforcement action involving FCC licensing must be specifically identified with a diverting jurisdiction. That is, as Stephen noted in the executive summary, a license held by a county should not be the subject of action if the state is diverting 911 fees. Lastly, we also recommend modifying the annual 911 fee questionnaire instructions to identify changes in the law, the final FCC rules, and the potential for future action if diversion of 911 fees occurs. Thank you. At this point, I will hand it over to Karima and Dana, I think, for Working Group 3.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, Chief Folks, distinguished FCC officers and representatives, Strike Force Committee members, Working Group members, and the viewing public. My name is Karima Holmes, and I serve as the chair of Working Group 3. Next slide. Today, I am joined by Dana Wahlberg, Working Group 3's vice chair, and we acknowledge our other esteemed Working Group members, including Chief Terry Clark, Kelly Merriweather, Deputy Chief Nicole Pickerell, Mark Reddish, Peter Beckwith, and Barbara Neal. Dana and I are pleased to have this opportunity to come before you on the Working Group's behalf to share our findings, conclusions, and recommendations to Congress on the impacts of 911 fee diversion. Next slide. Working Group 3 was tasked with defining and distinguishing impacts on 911 fee diversion. We also had the direction that same direction with regards to 911 underfunding. Vice Chair Dana Wahlberg will describe our method of categorizing these impacts, and then I'll return with some points that we determine are key enough to spell out in our report. And then we'll end our final discussion with conclusions and a handful of recommendations. Next slide, and I will turn it over to Dana.
Thank you, Karima, and good morning, everyone. One of the first things that Working Group 3 did as we worked through our process is to brainstorm the impacts. And after compiling an extensive list, and very quickly, I might add, we further broke those out into 6 broad categories, which you see listed here as individual bullets. What we learned was there are not just the most obvious impacts, but it's really a concerning waterfall effect that impacts a wide breadth of the system overall. So when we look at basic operations, some of the examples or some of the impacts under basic operations are insufficient funding for staffing critical positions. We all know that the theme nationwide is that PSAPs are operating below minimum staffing. In addition, low staffing retention. There's a lack of competitive compensation and benefit packages commensurate with the expected level of performance of a 911 telecommunicator. This includes forced overtime. We all know there's a need to have bodies in the chairs 24/7, 365. And in requiring that to occur through forced overtime, it contributes to burnout, decreased wellness, and low morale. Insufficient funding to provide critical and essential training. This results in errors and slower call processing and dispatching times. The inability to purchase industry-specific ergonomically correct workstation results in work-related injuries and increased absence. And finally, equipment rooms lack proper attention, which results in premature equipment failures. So these are all operational impacts of fee diversion and or underfunding. When we look at the technology category, we find inadequate funding to plan, implement, and transition to next generation 911 while continuing in parallel to support legacy environments. This isn't a light switch switchover or changeover. We're maintaining 2 systems for a period of time, which again requires additional funding. Inadequate funding to integrate emerging technologies such as text to 911, a technology very much necessary for the deaf and hard of hearing population. Also, improved wireless location accuracy applications. Today, 80% of our 911 calls are coming from wireless devices, which provide a lesser level of location accuracy. And finally, things such as telecommunicator resources, integrating call handling protocol software to improve consistency and fulfilling all of the necessary questions in order to prepare and initiate an appropriate public safety response. Inability to replace end-of-life equipment. We know that in the IP environment, equipment wears out quicker. It's like having a laptop and not having an analog call handling piece of equipment. And these require a more regular cadence of replacement. And finally, a lack of integration with key systems to enable optimal performance. Think of the geospatial data sets that improve caller location accuracy, or solutions that provide supplemental data about an individual, such as personal health information. Other examples, multimedia communication, text, photos, video. Public alert and warning systems to provide timely notification to keep the public safe when they are in an area of crisis. And finally, and of paramount importance, is cybersecurity protections that are so essential to keep PSAPs protected now that they are transitioning into an IP environment. When we look at this third category of interoperability, the ability to transfer critical information between the 911 call and the emergency responders through the PSAP is vital. 911 fee diversion or underfunding prevents quality of 911 call processing and sets the stage for the entire rest of the response. So when a 911 call is effectively and optimally answered and processed, it certainly lends itself to a better outcome as that call flows through the rest of the process. And when that doesn't occur, it places an increased burden on responders who are stymied due to their inability to interface seamlessly with the PSAP that they're connected to. Looking at the fourth bullet there, preparedness and planning, 911 underfunding prevents PSAPs the ability to perform necessary long-term strategic planning for a acceptable continuity of operations. The inability to follow best practices for preparing, responding to, and recovering from crises. Inadequate funding for backup equipment, such as UPS systems, generators, and redundant systems and infrastructures. The inability of personnel to be able to train and exercise how to respond to mitigation activities. Inadequate funding to ensure that an efficient response through the procurement of integration of mobile PSAPs and PSAPs in a box. For example, you know, when something happens to your primary PSAP, can you seamlessly transition over to a backup plan? The calls are going to continue to come in. The public is going to expect that those calls be processed. All of these, the lack of any of these things results in or contributes to stymied recovery from catastrophic events. And during catastrophic events may very well likely be one of the most critical times that a PSAP needs to function optimally. Number 5, we look at public trust and accountability. 911's customers are every single American and visitor to our country in their time of need. And that trust starts before the 911 call is placed, when the emergency starts and ends, and when our industry can prove accountability. So to that end, I think that's just a really key point, is public trust starts before the 911 call is placed and before the emergency, and when the emergency starts, excuse me. And it doesn't end until our industry can prove accountability. We must maintain the public's trust. Trust fades when 911 fees collected for 911 purposes are not being spent on 911, or when a lack of funding for education and outreach is not possible. And finally, looking at that bottom one, 911 fee oversight and administration, when 911 fees are diverted, the 911 program's mission, values, and vision may be prevented from being fulfilled. This includes resources that could monitor and audit fee uses from either being non-existent or being cut. And that results in having an unclear guidance on authoritative support to ensure diversion is not occurring, and also fosters inconsistent interpretations of acceptable expenditures. So here you see that it's a full waterfall effect, not just on the operations and technology side, but on interoperability between and amongst platforms and all the way through to the administration of the fees. So it is a very significant breadth of impacts. And if we go to the next slide, please. In conjunction with these 6 categorized topic areas, we also identified 11 key points. And these key points emphasize the depth and the impact that fee diversion or underfunding places on 911 services. And at this time, I'd like to turn Working Group 3's report back over to Chair Karima Holmes to report out on those 11 key points. Karima?
Thank you, Dana. Next slide. So these points really drive home what we gathered over these months of discussion and research, and the group was in concert on them. So key point 1, 911 fee diversion is a harmful practice. It exacerbates challenges we already face in PSAPs. We all agree to the far-reaching consequences that have and will continue to be in our space when underfunding and or fee diversion occurs in 911. Next slide. Key point 2, this point is true in that we understand the vital link 911 plays in all aspects of public safety, connecting people to the help they need and remaining in contact while delivering key information to responders that are going to the scene. This point just states that 911 is an invaluable bond for both the caller and the responder that goes out. Next slide. Key point 3 is another point we have not shied away from, and that is the fact that even in most states that do indeed properly apply 911 fees, the cost to efficiently operate 911 services exceeds that revenue stream. Next slide. Key point 4 explains that when 911 is shorted, everything in that division could fall victim to being cut. It could be dependent on budget, priorities, political environments, organizational authorities. But the point remains, every service in the 911 center could be shaved when proper funding is not there. Next slide. As the industry is really pushing to move faster to an evolving ecosystem for 911, and that could be as infrastructure, evolution, operations, technology toward the needed next generation 911, that transition is being directly threatened, and we have all witnessed some stagnation in its reality because of diversion and or underfunding. Next slide. Key point 6 states we define 911 underfunding as occurring when funding levels are below the levels required for optimal performance of 911 operations. Again, we were also tasked with defining underfunding, and we gave it a very natural definition for underfunding because it's basic math. A 911 service fails to meet its intended purpose when we don't have the proper funding. And we all agree that 911 optimal performance is critical to our work and those we serve. Next slide. Key point 7 is also equally important. Here we just wanted to recognize that underfunding could occur with fee diversion rather, or without it. So underfunding could occur with fee diversion or underfunding could occur even if fee diversion wasn't an issue. Next slide. Following behind key point 7, number 8 emphasizes when both diversion, 911 fee diversion, and underfunding occurs, the impacts are devastating. Yet, even when diversion occurs and underfunding is not clearly determined, the diversion can still have negative effects on 911 services. Services are mitigative efforts that are key to ensure the public safety lifeline could be at risk here. Next slide. Key point 9 states 911 fee diversion and or underfunding not only prevents 911 programs from implementing new and emerging technologies, but also harm critical services employed today. We wanted to drive home here that funding shortfalls not only prevent future growth in a 911 program, but today we see the results of fee diversion and underfunding in outdated equipment, staff shortages, operations not being adequately performed. Overall, this awareness is central for us who are to respond to the evolving landscape of the country and its public safety responses. Next slide. Key point 10 focuses on the most important aspect in the 911 center, those behind the headset. These are the folks that we ask to take on these duties daily and with a fervor that is required to properly respond, triage, and effectively communicate our 911 services in the United States. Fee diversion can affect the adoption of progressive tools that are key for emergency communications. And we know 911 services is a critical component of emergency communications, and that requires hiring, training, exercising highly qualified staff to meet the needs of our citizens. Next slide. The last key point, 11, is the impact of fee diversion and or underfunding of PSAPs will be evident to others in emergency communication, in the emergency communications ecosystem. For instance, law enforcement, fire, medical services. 911 is the vital link, and we must stay afloat and perform optimally in order to support our boots on the ground that physically respond to emergencies. Next slide. These are our conclusions. These are our rounded and very matter-of-fact conclusions. 911 fee diversion impacts include reduced capacity to answer and dispatch 911 calls, reduced capacity to hire, train, and retain qualified staff, increased potential for misrouted calls and or slower call processing times, reduced ability for investments in new technology, and the erosion of public trust due to the public's lack of confidence in the ability of our jurisdictions to provide emergency services. Next slide. This is Working Group 3's 4 recommendations. Working Group 3 makes the following recommendations: that states should be provided with additional guidance on how to respond to the agency's annual questionnaire. Jurisdictions should have mechanisms in place to review and act upon fee diversion and or underfunding. Additional research is needed to understand the relationship between 911 fee diversion and underfunding and emergency response. And jurisdictions should have oversight mechanisms to ensure funding mechanisms are optimized. That concludes Working Group 3's report. I'd like to again thank my subcommittee members for their time and tireless efforts on this. Thank you, Kelly and Stephen, for your larger leadership with us. And thanks to the Commission for allowing us this important topic to be addressed and brought before this audience and Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Karima, and thank you all for those excellent presentations. I think we all see how hard you worked. And in conclusion, I would just like to go on to the next slide, please. The strike force members spent hundreds of volunteer hours on these recommendations to end fee diversion and to safeguard the long-term sustainability of 911 in America. The recommendations developed by these 3 independent working groups and adopted by the whole 911 strike force as a whole, and that's an important point, should be considered holistically when they're being considered by Congress and the FCC and other parties. And a very careful and measured approach should be taken to considering these and in solving the critical issues. So while the findings summarize the work of the 3 working groups working independently, each group's recommendation should be reviewed holistically and considered holistically as that type of approach to end fee diversion. And the recommendations from each working group should be specifically reviewed by Congress, the FCC, and federal agencies and local agencies. We really appreciate all of your work. I think that everyone appreciates the complexity and the depth and breadth of this issue, from technology all the way down to the people sitting in the PSAPs behind the headset. And so we thank Congress and the FCC for the opportunity to study this issue. We have found, as cited in the report, that there are additional issues that may need to be considered further. More time is needed on some of the more complex issues, like the licensing issue and the definition of the applicability of fees and the uses of fees. But now I would just like to conclude our presentation to the FCC and the public and pause now for questions from the public. John?
Thank you, Kelly. At this point, I would like to ask Rachel Ware of the FCC, have we received any questions from the public?
John, we have not received any questions via live questions.
Okay. Kelly, considering that we are about 15 minutes over our scheduled time here, I would, for your consideration, suggest proceeding to the strike force discussion and vote.
All right. Thank you, John. I think that's an excellent suggestion. So we will move on to the discussion portion of our meeting, and everyone can join in the discussion. Working group members can join in, working group only members can join in, 911 strike force members can join in. And so I would open the floor to discussion of the report that we've distributed as the final report for our vote and consideration, and ask if there are any issues or discussion that needs to take place among our members. All right. Hearing none, I will call on, I'll start the call for the vote. We will move on to our section and vote on the report. And I would ask if there is a motion.
Hi, Kelly. This is Karima. I'd like to make a motion for the 911 Strike Force vote to approve the report as written and presented, and also approve the FCC to make non-editorial changes to the report.
Thank you, Karima, for that motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second it. This is Richard Bradford.
Thank you. And the second. I will now call on each parent committee or alternate representative who is present to give an affirmative yes or a negative no to adopt the 911 Strike Force fee report in its entirety. Are there any questions before we vote? All right. Let me find my roll call list. All right, where is, oh, sorry, here I was already. Okay, I will start with Cindy Barbera Burrell,
Yes.
Richard Bradford,
Yes.
Daryl Branson,
Yes.
Terry Clark, Budge Courier,
Yes.
Lori Flaherty. I believe Lori was absent. Sean Golden,
Yes.
April Heinze,
Yes.
Karima Holmes,
Yes.
Thaddeus Johnson,
Yes.
Mel Meyer,
Yes.
Nicole Pickrell,
Yes.
Mark Reddish, and or his alternative, Allison Venable.
Yes.
Thank you. Lance Terry,
Yes.
Dana Wahlberg,
Yes.
and Stephen Sharp.
Yes.
And I also vote. Motion carries, the ayes have it, and the report is approved. Thank you all. Great work. Huge accomplishment. Thank you all very much. John, what's next?
Thank you, Kelly. By my count, it appears that it's unanimous vote to adopt and send this report to Congress. 15 strike force members voted in the affirmative, and there were 2 members that did not attend this call. So I think we can conclude this session. And thank you all for your service. I'd like to just offer a couple of brief comments before we depart. First of all, I want to the strike force members and the working group members, I want to thank you all for volunteering to serve on this important study and for all your hard work this summer and diligence in producing this report under very tight statutory timelines. It's been a pleasure to work with you. You're a very knowledgeable group and dedicated group of individuals, and you bring a wealth of expertise and viewpoints to this vital issue of how to stop 9/1 fee diversion. As you all know, on or before September 23rd, the FCC staff will publish the final report on the website of the commission. And on your behalf, the commission will submit the report to the Committee on Energy and Commerce of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation of the Senate. Thank you all. This concludes our meeting, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.